Well, good morning to everybody that's out in Michigan watching us. This is the first time that we've done a webinar that's kind of an interview format or a conversation format. And we thought it was a good idea to have an opportunity for board members, superintendents, business managers to start kind of digesting the adequacy study that was done earlier this year in Michigan. And with me today is Craig Thiel from the Citizens Research Council. Craig is, how long have you been with Citizens Research Council?
Getting on 10 years now.
10 years. Craig and I go way back when he was at Senate Fiscal Agency, when I was on legislative staff. CRC, if you're unfamiliar with them, and I'll have Craig talk a little bit about them too, is an organization that, unlike the adequacy study that we're talking about where you hire a firm to do some work, CRC is nonpartisan, not for hire, a nonprofit that goes out and really does in-depth analysis on ballot issues. Probably now about 6 years ago, you did a really extensive study on education in Michigan, not on funding, but on how we deliver education in Michigan. You want to talk a little bit more about CRC and your work there, I guess?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. And just picking up where Don left off, a little introduction about CRC. We're a 100-year-old organization based in Michigan. We have offices in Lansing and in Livonia. And our core mission is just to deliver objective, nonpartisan public policy research. So when it comes time for elected officials, whether they're school board members, city council members, state legislators, to make those tough decisions on which way to go on an important public affairs, public policy issue, they're armed with the best research. And so our focus has been primarily on state and local government finance issues as well as governance issues. I've done a considerable amount of work on K-12 education, finance, and governance. That's where I'm focusing most of my attention now. We have a colleague who works on state budget, state finance issues. I have a colleague who works on healthcare issues, and then a local government expert on staff. So all of our research is available free of charge on our website, which is crcmich.org. I'd encourage all your members and all the attendees today to go out there, take a look at us if they're not familiar with us, get on our mailing list, and you'll get updates about new reports that come out, new presentations that we've done when we're quoted in the newspaper and whatnot. So we really think we're a resource to both elected officials and the general public as well. You mentioned ballot proposals. We are the only organization statewide that always analyzes statewide ballot proposals. We think that in those instances, the voters of the state are the de facto public policymakers, and they too should be armed with the most important and relevant information on an issue so they can make the decision that's best for them. So
I concur. I mean, for those that are listening, CRC, if you're not familiar, wonderful organization. I know our organization this year did a resolution to your 100th anniversary this year, I think, in research in Michigan. And it is just a great source for people that want to know what's going on in Lansing, but not reading a legislative analysis, but really a big policy analysis. I think it's great. But they want to hear us talk a little bit about the adequacy study that happened for us in Michigan. And in inviting you in, you guys do so much research. I know you've looked at the study and wanted to just kind of talk to somebody that's familiar with research. We've had analysis from kind of the media side of things. We, of course, have looked at it ourselves. I don't think there's any report that's ever perfect as it comes out. But as a researcher, because you aren't for hire, nobody's setting the parameters for you when you do studies. In this case, in statute and legislation, the parameters were set for them. I'm sure you've looked at kind of the parameters of the study. How would you, as a researcher, have looked at that and, based on, I guess, comparison what they did on the research and what you thought of the parameters related to that? How much did that tie a researcher's hands?
Right. Well, you're right, Don. It was very prescriptive in how to both set up the study, what was supposed to be included in the study, and some of the what I, as a researcher, might consider nuanced methodologies that they were supposed to use, as well as metrics that they were supposed to use. Our approach at the CRC is kind of, give us the big questions you want answered, and then let us go out and find, the best data sources, the best measures, scan nationally, best practices, consolidate all that information and present it to, the public, the elected officials that we're kind of serving. In this case, it was and you probably know better than I, it was really a trade-off in a political conversation surrounding the road funding package, the statewide road funding proposal, and this was something that came out of those discussions. So it's not surprising that it's super prescriptive coming out of the legislature. I guess, and we'll get into the details here, it's the first time we've had a study like this done in Michigan. Other states, there's been multiple done. Yeah. We aren't cutting edge in any sense in terms of this study coming out. Like I said, other states have done it. But it is the first one, so it starts a conversation. I'm sure the study will continue to get picked over both by detractors and supporters of it. But it gets that conversation going, including yesterday the study authors, to my knowledge, have made their first public presentation in Michigan to the State Board of Ed. And I tuned in and watched that and learned a little from that as well.
Well, and I know nationally, Augenblick is on adequacy studies or equity studies in the United States has probably done more than any other firm. So, I mean, if you were DMB or DTMB looking at an RFP on that, and they're picking the firm that has done more of these than any other entity in the country. So, and I think that those that are out there as detractors, I mean, this is a reputable firm that has a broad knowledge base in doing adequacy studies across the country, and like many of them, and you see in some states a study's been done and there's legislative action, particularly if the court ordered a study, which wasn't the case here. And then we've had others where a study is done, nothing happens in the legislature, entities, school districts, parents sue, and the courts order something to happen. And it's unclear where Michigan's going to go with that, whether the governor was a part of this and he will present his budget in the in the spring of next year, be working on it this fall, and it'll be interesting to see whether he will be putting something forward in that. In the last 2 years, he has recognized that at-risk wasn't increased in funding for a 10-year period of time and started putting money in there. And one of the things that we saw in the study was, as they looked at they call it vertical equity in between students in the same school, that very clearly we weren't doing a good job in Michigan on English language learners and at-risk students as far as funding them. Have you looked at other research nationally on that kind of poverty issue as it relates to education?
Yeah. Well, let me just go back. One point that you raised, which is important, especially in terms of what kind of traction this gets, because of how this report was required, it's a big question in my mind, who's going to be the champion for this report? There's little secret that this was the result of the Democratic caucus and the legislature asking for this report to be done, and it being a trade-off with negotiating with the Republican caucus. The governor didn't necessarily ask for this in the road funding debate. So a question, and this is probably for the political pundits out there to really ask, who's going to be the champion of this? You mentioned the governor's budget will be released for the next fiscal year in January, February of next year. Will he include any of the recommendations from this study in that? If he's not the champion, I'd be surprised if he did. The legislature, at least the Republicans in the legislature, didn't ask for the study. They may not become champions for this. So I think that's something to consider as we look forward to how this kind of rolls out and what kind of attention it continues to get.
Well, and I think it's a great point on who the champion is. I think part of that is, from MASB's perspective, making it in the best interest of a legislator and other elected officials to become the champion. So that's going to mean, things like this where we're starting the conversation, we're bringing this information out to our members, and getting it out to parents so that parents and educators can become the champions and start convincing their legislators that they can't ignore a study that was done. I mean, the state spent the money on it. Why would you leave it sitting on a shelf? That's one question that should be asked of them. And so I think it's going to be incumbent upon parents and educators and associations like ours to put legislators and elected officials in a place to say, I can't afford not to, if not be a champion, at least have that conversation happening around the Capitol.
Yes, it needs to be discussed, and my point in bringing up the champion isn't to advocate for one group or the other,
right,
but it does beg the question, who's going to take on that role, and it's an important study in the sense that we haven't done one before. It gets the conversation going, and getting your members acquainted with it, the details of it, and then their districts familiar with it is a good first step towards keeping the discussion going on this topic.
You probably don't like to, in your office you probably analyze other researchers all the time, but I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit and say, looking at the study, maybe not in research methodology, but when you look at it, maybe even as a parent yourself, but what did you see as kind of the greatest strengths of the study, whether it be in recommendations or just in how they did things?
Yeah. Well, I think the study did what it was asked to do, given these various parameters that were set up in the legislation. So it hit, I would say, 90% of the things that it was asked to do, and we can talk about where it's deficient in terms of what it was asked to do. It looks at the financing structure of the state. I think it understands that pretty well. It gets to this number that everyone's talking about, this $8,667 number, and kind of frames that in a kind of an understandable way, at least the way I understand it, which is good because school finance issues can get really murky and really difficult to understand, even amongst the school officials. Once you get out to the public, good number of the public still think that lottery funds the majority of education, and we know it runs education system for about a day or so. So so those are some of the good things I think the report did, and again, everyone would probably look at it and see things that are different than how I see them as a researcher, but.
On the flip side, and you kind of alluded to it, so shortfalls, kind of where was an opportunity missed, or maybe an area that was kind of overlooked?
Right. So very clearly, the legislation asked them to look at a number of different aspects of school funding. One of them, which was and the report concedes this, was special education. This is an issue that the CRC has done some work on, both the statewide system, but also more recently we looked at kind of the special ed population and finances in Detroit and what's going on there. And it acknowledges that our way of tracking special ed finances, both the spending and the revenue, didn't allow them to do the analysis that they were asked to do. So as a result, the information on special ed is kind of based on their experience in other states. Yeah. So that's a pitfall, but a pitfall that they were kind of hamstrung by the data that's available. But one area where I'm still scratching my head, and this has to do with the finances of the charter sector. I can't read in the legislation anywhere where it says to exclude charter schools in their analysis. And yesterday during the State Board of Ed meeting, the question came up, and they gave a response that charter schools are opening and closing more frequently than traditional public schools. That districts, that is going to make for the more difficult time to do the analysis. But at the same time, we're talking about over 10% of the school-age population, public school-age population, is left out of the equation here, as is 10% of the revenues and expenditures. And so I was fully expecting them to talk about charters. Now the report doesn't tell them to compare, measures of adequacy, equity, charters versus traditional public. It just says talk about adequacy and equity for all public schools in the state of Michigan, and in my opinion, that includes charter schools. So
yeah, I would subscribe to the same when we looked at it, and maybe their problem, because they did rely on work they'd done in other states as they kind of extrapolated, and Michigan is one of a few states really that have the number of charters that we have, and so for them, they probably have very little experience in trying to include that in an adequacy study, because I haven't looked at the numbers, and I'll take what he said at the board meeting yesterday, at face value, but we have a lot of charters that have been around, for a long time.
Yes.
So, 20 years of charters, and yes, we've seen them close and open over time, but you would think out of 300 or so charter schools, and yes, the number has grown, that there was a stable enough population for them to be able to look at that and say, here's 100 schools that maybe have never closed in that 20-year period. That's a pretty stable population, and maybe I'm way off base in that, but it seems like there would be enough stability in Michigan's charter population that they would have just been a part of it, and they could have talked about them a little bit more.
Yeah. I know for a fact they looked at 5 years worth of information, the 2009-2010 school year through the 2013-2014. So that's 5 years. They could have used a kind of a rule that we're only going to look at the charter districts that were in existence for those 5 years. So exclude some of the charters that have popped up during that period or closed during that period from their analysis and make that case. Mm-hmm. But instead they decided not to include any charters. And again, I think it's a pitfall because we don't know how the 10% of the revenue and 10% of the expenditures, and I'm using rough figures here, that are attributable to that aspect of the public schools funding in Michigan really would have swayed those numbers. Would it make that 866.7 number lower, or would it make it higher? We don't know. It's a question that's out there.
I'll go back to the special ed piece that you brought up, because I know you said you've done some looking at it yourself. This is an interpretation question, see if you're interpreting it the same way. So this has come up. So they show the 8,667 is what they would say was the new base.
Right.
Now my interpretation as it related to kind of that vertical equity related to at-risk and ELL students, that as we recognize that population needs additional money, to me it was above the 8667, not as a part of.
That's my understanding.
Okay.
They go through an analysis that creates a need factor for every district. And basically what they do is they weight the different student population depending on the nature of the student. So they say a general ed student is a weight of 1. A special ed student is a weight of 2.0. A ELL student is the weight of 1.3. I'm sorry, at-risk 1.3, and an ELL student 1.4. So that 8667 number is essentially one unit, one general ed student. A special ed student would be 2 times that 8667 number. Yep. That's it. And those weights are important. They did do a survey of school officials throughout the state, asking them, in their professional judgment, what the additional costs are associated with these special need populations. They use that information plus the study team, their previous experience in other states to come up with these weights. These weights look similar to what they came up with in other states, but they are, in their opinion, unique to Michigan. They're specific to Michigan. I know, for example, in other states, the weights for special ed students were above that additional 1.0 almost consistently, and they set the weight in Michigan at 1.0. So,
you mentioned we know the special ed. They have set it aside. Couldn't get the information. As a former ISD board member myself, I clearly understand when you look at federal funding, state funding, ISD millages, and of course the ISD millages being different across the state. And then we have millage equalization that really doesn't do its job in the school aid fund. I get why special ed didn't get the attention it should have had in this. As CRC has looked at special ed, have you encountered some of the same even without the parameters of the study, have you encountered the same difficulty in trying to get to a real comparison and looking at how we spent fund special ed
Yes.
in Michigan.
So in 2012 we did this. It was kind of as an add-on to some larger education research that we had done. And immediately once I got into the numbers, I realized doing anything on a district by district level was going to be almost impossible because of the data limitations that were highlighted in this report. So my approach then was I had to make a judgment call. I decided to look at special ed finances at the ISD level. So what I ended up doing is I ended up comparing Wayne, Risa, and Ingham, and all of the ISDs in terms of their revenue and in terms of their expenditures. You know, we don't think of special ed as being delivered by ISDs. We kind of think of special ed as being kind of coordinated at the ISD level, but the services are delivered in the district, and most of the district personnel, special ed personnel, are at the district level. So yeah, I had the same realization as the study team did, but I just decided let's do it at the ISD level. And you know, I got some pushback on that, but that was the best that the data would allow us to do.
Which I think begs the question, and this is always a rub for us as representing school districts. School districts are about educating kids, not reporting information. Although it seems with the legislature and MDE and CEPI, we become about reporting at times. It seems like more than about educating kids. And so another place this has come up is, as we've compared to other states on personnel, there's sometimes a lot more personnel data out there related to, say, contracts for employees and everything. And in Michigan, we really have very little reporting on that. So based on the data sets that we needed on finance, and particularly, say, special ed, I mean, would there be a way for us to provide more information to be able to analyze how we do things in Michigan, but at the same time without requiring substantially more reporting at a district level?
I guess what you're asking is, you know, can we slice and dice the data that we currently have, and are we collecting? And, you know, I think in the special ed category, I tried that in 2012 and kind of, you know, hit a brick wall. The study team here with the adequacy study, a similar one, and their proposal is very clear. It says states should consider a new way to track this information. So that suggests to me that the call is to add on to the reporting, and I know that, you know,
we don't love that.
You don't like that idea, but I think to get the answer that, you know, was asked for in this study, the question that was asked for in the study, and the questions I tried to ask in 2012 and kind of had to change course, you would have to ask for different information and report out differently. You know, and there's going to be a number of, you know, challenges in doing that. You might say right from the get-go, well, the reason we're doing it the way we are now is because we couldn't do it the way that's being proposed, but that may be a discussion based on, you know, the evolution of finance reporting since that time, since the determination was made to do it the way we do it. Maybe things have changed. Well,
and I also think, I mean, you said that special ed is viewed as a local deliverable, but I mean, part of, I think, even trying to create a report, I mean, we have ISDs that are very center-based, and they do provide special ed programming, and a lot of it, and then you have other counties where it's all pass-through money, and the ISD doesn't do anything, and then there's some hybrids of that. So I do think that the funding structure of where money comes from and how we deliver it is so varied, it might be difficult to take a snapshot of how Michigan...
It is, and, you know, I mean, we got to bring our history books out and recall that when we did Proposal A 20-some years ago, we dealt almost exclusively with the general ed financing picture. We left off the table the funding for capital, and we left off the table and the discussions funding for special ed. You know, I think if you talk to those people who were involved in those discussions at the time, they would have loved to have dealt with both of those issues at the time, but the complexity of the general ed funding was so large that that was going to eat up all their time. And maybe their hope was that in the future, capital was dealt with and special ed was dealt with, and 20 years later, we basically are still operating the same systems in terms of financing those. And those are becoming increasingly important aspects of school finance and school funding in the state of Michigan. You know, as a special ed population, maintains its size and grows in some districts, and the capital facilities, obviously, as buildings and other infrastructure deteriorates over time, and we're using the same model that we've been using more or less for 50 years to finance capital.
In their 86-67 in the study, they actually broke it down by categories within expenditures in a school district. And one that they have, of course, is transportation. So you talk about infrastructure funding, and we're starting to hear more and more from our districts, even though back in Proposal A, as you mentioned, they took a bunch of categoricals and created this foundation. From an expenditure standpoint, we have districts that have hundreds of thousands of miles that they drive in every year, in another district that's at tens of thousands. And, just as a researcher analyzing, what kind of impact do you think that it has on that kind of, here's one pot of money that this district gets the same as the other, but they're having to spend it in such different ways?
Yeah. And I mean, you raise a good point with transportation. That's clearly, there's a lot of variety there. There's other aspects within those categories where there's a lot of variation too. I think in trying to refine the number that's being reported, that 8667 number, the study team applied what they called some efficiency screens. So they took out those districts that had inordinately high expenditures in any of those categories relative to their peers. So those numbers wouldn't kind of overinflate or reduce that 8667 number. So they took that out, but they acknowledged that yes, in rural parts of the state where transportation is provided, the per pupil cost of doing so is much greater than in more densely populated parts of the state. Yep. And unfortunately, we don't differentiate our foundation allowance to account for those type of things. There's been calls to do that, to look at location, student need, cost of living. These are factors that you would use to differentiate funding in the state. Instead, our model is basically a one-size-fits-all in terms of funding for general ed education.
I see one of our first questions, and I haven't said, but clearly we'll get to a point, and it's fine at any time to throw in questions. And I see one posed, which is whether the 21st Century Education Commission is going to look at the adequacy study recommendations. My understanding, as part of their charge from the governor, this is one of the areas that they are supposed to take a look at.
Yeah.
And you understand it the same
way?
way?
Yeah, and I think I was planning to point that out as when we were talking about who's going to be the champion. The development of this 21st Education study group is kind of after, it came to be after this study both was asked for and completed. So yeah, I think they're going to take that as an input. I mean, their charge is much larger, but yes, they have to talk about finances, and this will be an important piece of information they use. That group originally was supposed to have their recommendations done in November of 2016, and my understanding is that's pushed off to February of 2017, which is about the time when the governor is supposed to release his budget for the 17-18 year. It's likely he'll have a good sense of what's in that report before the deadline, and if he's going to make some recommendations in the budget, they might be based on that task force work.
Can you open that one up, Phil, so we can see?
Our special ed students identified.
I mean, that would just, to me, I'm guessing the question, how are special ed students identified from a study perspective, would be just as they're identified by the districts.
In looking at this study, I think they used a 1 or 0. So if you have an IEP, you're a special ed student. It didn't look at the nature of the disability, and we know there's a number of categories that kids can be identified in at least the student accounting data that we have. They didn't differentiate, a child with on the autism spectrum versus someone who might have a cognitive impairment versus someone who might have a physical impairment. So they just said, IEP, that student is a 1, no IEP, that student.
Yeah, so when you're using a 2.0 multiplier,
Yes.
Somebody that's really
Highly involved, the needs are extreme, and you might say that the spending associated with that child is much greater than somebody who has a less involved disability. They were treated equally.
And our funding formula, both federally and Michigan, doesn't go down to that level. It doesn't do it on a per pupil, per disability basis now. So that would be very hard to create a system that was.
My understanding, you might know this, being on boards that you've served and obviously working with boards. ISDs set up their special ed plans very differently in the state, and some may look at the nature of the disability in determining the funding allocation at the district level as opposed to what's coming down from the state or coming down from the federal government. The state and the federal government treating a special ed student, regardless of disability, the same. The ISD special ed funding plan might differentiate with those based on those disabilities.
Yeah. One of the things in the study, and I see a couple other questions, I want to ask one more for myself. The parameter that the study set up for, quote unquote, a successful district, that seemed to, in kind of both media and other analysis after, people have really kind of questioned the idea of the successful district, and one, whether being above average was successful enough. Should that be where we aim for, is just being, just above the state average? But also people have then questioned who the districts are when you look at them and what they look like compared to, do we have a district out there that maybe has a significant at-risk population that's performing above average? What was your thought on how and the researchers didn't have much choice in that, but on that parameter in doing a study?
Yeah. Well, and that's one of the first things they say in the report, and that they've in the public comments is, most of the times when we're asked to do this, we're asked to determine what success means, and a lot of times the bar is set much higher. In the case of Michigan study, it was laid out in the legislation. It was, a district that is above the average of all statewide districts on all of the tested subjects. So, you think of it's average, just barely above average. And keep in mind, our averages are very low. So we're setting the bar just above an already low bar. And, they say, the study team said that if they were to do this in other states, they would come up with what success might be, and it probably would be a higher bar. Now, they've also, in identifying that 8667 number, and throughout the report, they said, we're going to apply what the state says is successful with some other measures of success. And they have 3 other measures that they came up with. There's a growth success metric. There's a special populations measure of success, where they look at districts based on their special need populations and determine where they are doing exceptionally well academically, and called those out. And then they did absolute performance, those that are well and above the above average. And they said, if you meet the above average, the one that the state set, in one of these other categories, then what we're going to call you is a notably successful. And that's where most of their analysis focuses, and that's where the 8667 number that everyone's talking about comes out of. It comes out of those notably successful districts.
So in essence, they did what they probably always do in a study with the notably successful, and said, here's where we normally do it, so we're going to include this in the study. Here's the ones that we were supposed to based on the study. So your anticipation, because my next question would have been, so if they would have picked the 75th percentile, that 8667 would be much higher, but if you're saying it comes out of that notably successful, maybe it wouldn't be significantly higher, or would you think it would still grow?
Well, I think, and no one's looked at this, where do those districts rank on, the top to bottom, and where do their schools in those districts rank? But my guess is, they are above the average in the state, and the intent being that by the study team was that, we think that the bar is set too low, we want to set it a little higher, and we think you should direct your attention here. The data that the state asked for, the analysis is still in the report, but the primary focus is on those notably successful districts. And, they identified 180 with the excluding the outliers, which were the really high spending districts, 180 in there above average, the state mandated, and then 54 districts in the notably successful category, excluding outliers. So really, the 8667 number applies to those 54 districts statewide.
Okay. I see another question, and because of the way that our screen is looking, I'm having a hard time actually reading them.
Were the bonds and millages that many districts benefit from taken into consideration?
Bonds and millages, bonds were, Craig, you're the researcher on this. The infrastructure side was kind of set aside, and clearly there is an impact to a district. If you have a brand new building, the learning facilities themselves do have an impact on learning. I don't think anybody would dispute that. As it relates to millages, you've got, even though sinking funds are related to infrastructure, you have regional enhancement millage in some of our counties, and of course you have a hold harmless millage. How did the study get into that much?
Right. Well, they have a separate section on capital and looked at districts who had passed millages and what's happened with their spending, and they do that, and they were asked to do that. But it's important to note that their main focus is on operating spending. So they would exclude the capital spending from that. Sinking fund millages they would exclude from that. But if you had an enhancement millage, which you're using basically as operating revenue, that would be included in your revenue pot for that district, and therefore the spending in that district. The hold harmless millages, they dealt with those as the higher spending districts in a lot of cases, and those were excluded in a number of the analysis. They present the information for districts in total, including those hold harmless, and then they say excluding outliers. And most of my focus was on the excluding the outliers data.
Well, I think in one of their recommendations, they even say, as we look at a funding formula to try to create greater equity, they say to give everybody the same foundation, but then also create an exception to say that they actually say to go back to kind of, they don't say this in term, but that catch-up kind of idea for the bottom. And they also say outside of those that have a local millage that they adopt, that's adopted by the voters, which is what our hold harmless millages are.
Right. We got to remember, Proposal A, the model was rather than bring everyone down to some number, bring those at the bottom up, and that they recognize the political realities that it's difficult to take resources away. So they say deal with this outlier group separately. If you want to improve equity, you want to change funding, work from the bottom up.
Okay. I see another question from Howard.
How much will the recommendation of the adequacy study cost? Has there been any discussion on how the increased costs be paid for?
We're in the very preliminary stages. Legislature's been out since this has been released for all practical purposes. The only number that's now circulating around Lansing, it came out of because they didn't total it in the study that I saw. Bridge Magazine did an article and put it at $1.4 billion. How they added those pieces up, if they calculated the 1.4, the 1.3 for our populations, and the 2.0 for special ed, and the 8667. I'm not sure. I don't know if you guys have looked at it to know what kind of dollar amount, total amount we'll be talking about.
Right. That's a question that I think is still outstanding right now. It's not mentioned in the report. A number of the criticisms of the report initially said, well, what does this mean? If you look across the country, usually these studies generate a number on a per pupil basis, and then what the total needs to be statewide. That isn't included here. My guess is there will be further analysis to try to suss that out. Yes, I saw the numbers that Bridge put out, and I think what they tried to do, they did something with the foundation. Well, I'd point out that 8667 number isn't necessarily directly apples for apples with the foundation, because included in the 8667 number is a small amount of federal dollars that might be spent by a district on their general ed population. They pulled out the federal dollars for special needs students, special ed, ELL, at risk, they took those dollars out. But there are some federal dollars in there. So right off the bat, the foundation and this 8667 number aren't apples for apples comparable.
Yeah, and I don't think anybody would expect, as we're trying to, if the legislature, in fact, or the governor tries to move in that direction, those that would be above 8667 aren't going to sit. And we would argue that they shouldn't sit there until we get up to that point. So there's going to be a cost even beyond whatever the study says to get to X,
right? Because
you're going to still have to fund things as we go
right.
forward.
You know, in the legislature, the way they've kind of moved folks up is using this 2X formula. Making sure that every district, when there was a bump in the foundation, got some increase, but those at the bottom got proportionately larger.
Yeah, and I think, to the question, like, where does the money come from? So I think the one answer is we don't have a firm number on the total cost of doing this. And that will come out, as you said, as more analysis is done. Where does the money come from? Clearly, if the dollar is north of $1 billion, which probably is realistic to think of, trying to take $1 billion out of the current general fund and doing that would not, it would impact programs that also impact the kids that go to our schools. So that wouldn't be a good place to start. So I think tax revenue has to be a place that is a conversation. And when I have looked at other states that have had adequacy studies, and through either court order or through legislative action, I mean, very few of them have been a rob Peter to pay Paul. I mean, they've almost always looked at other sources of revenue. Now in Michigan, lottery, we already have it. We already, are dealing with tobacco settlement monies and it's being spent. So there's not, like other states have used some of those pots of money to actually fund higher education or fund K-12 education based on adequacy studies. I mean, it seems to me, and I don't know what other thoughts you would have, that you would be going either through the legislative process or the voters to say, here's the study. Clearly, if we agree with the study and that there is an additional funding needed, which we would agree with, somebody's asking either the legislature or the voters to add to the current tax structure, or look at the kind of that tax credit and deduction side of the world that we see with businesses and others to minimize. Do you see differently than that, or?
Well, I mean, it's inescapable that they've asked. They've put a number out there that's greater than what we're spending now. What the total is, we don't know. How we come up with the money, if there's the political will to find that additional revenue to put in the K-12 priority, how we do that is unknown to me. I mean, it will be a function of the kind of the political debate in the legislature, whether it's new taxes, increased existing taxes, pulling out of other areas. All of those, I would suspect, are on the table. One of the things that the report says we're not going to do is we're not going to, rob Peter to pay Paul. We're not going to. We don't recommend, reducing the high spending districts to give money to the low spending districts.
Yeah,
that's about the only recommendation on how dealing with the resource side of the equation. I guess stay tuned. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I've even argued over time with our own members here that, when there is that kind of angst with higher spending districts, we don't want to all push towards, even though we used average as kind of a benchmark here, we don't want to push our funding to say, let's bring the top down so everybody has not enough money. The idea is to get more money to the bottom. And I see one of the questions that came up was, due to the overwhelming defeat of Proposal 1,
yeah,
how do you go back to the voters? And I think there's a lot of arguments that would say that Proposal 1 may not be a good comparison for a ballot initiative. One, I don't know that, even though some of the polling showed it going into that, yes, roads are important to people, but predominantly we see this. We've done a much better job, not we MASB, but we as a kind of a citizenry and special interests have done a much better job in recent years of tracking the success of ballot issues at the local level. And so if you look back over the last couple of years, when a school district that does a good job of articulating their message about why something is needed at that local level related to education, whether it be a bond issue or a sinking fund, or even regional enhancement millages, we are seeing in municipalities are the same, really. We see those entities passing tax increases onto their voters in pretty decent, like their percentage that they're passing by is actually even pretty decent. And so I think the Proposal 1 analogy may not be the most accurate to use, although clearly doing something on a statewide basis and articulating that message is a much harder one than, having that articulated message as they did in the city of Lansing with their public schools this year to pass a bond issue. I don't know if you see things similarly or if...
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, Proposal 1 went down in historic defeat. I mean, let's be honest. And there were a number of reasons. The complexity would probably be the first one. I don't know that the issues on the table people didn't agree with in terms of, something to do with the roads. I mean, ultimately we did have the legislature address it. So, but the complexity really doomed that proposal. Running a statewide ballot campaign for education would be, I'd say it would probably be a pretty heavy lift. It would probably require a pretty diverse constituency to get it on board, outside, not just the school community, but probably the business community. Absolutely. And how that comes about, what that looks like, I have no idea. Yes, locally, bond proposals tend to pass. Sinking funds, operating millages, enhancement millages, by and large, pass. They're favorable. I think a lot of times people have a vested interest and they can see where those dollars are going because they drive by the school every day, or they're driving their kids to the school every day, so they see that. I should mention one other thing is there is a mention in the report that kind of loosening the constraints on local districts to levy additional resources to, and that could, in reading the report, that could be one option to get districts that are below this 8667 number up to the 8667. So it wouldn't require additional state resources, it would require additional local resources. And as we know, districts are pretty, their hands are tied pretty strongly in terms of, even if the voters there want to provide additional resources to their school, they're unable because of the constraints of Proposal A. So the report does talk about that in terms of the financing mechanisms for hitting that 8667 number.
Yeah, true. And without millage equalization, though, how many mills one district at the bottom would have to raise to get to 8667 versus another becomes pretty...
Right. Then we get the pre-proposal A problem where, you have to levy, 2 or 3 mills to barely move the needle, whereas in some districts you have to a fraction of a mill and the needle, you move it off the chart. So,
yeah, absolutely.
The state might have to be involved in some level on equalizing or doing some regional tax-based sharing to raise the resources. I mean, these are just proposals that have been out there and talked about.
Well, and you mentioned the heavy lift if we go to the ballot. I think that even if we go back to Proposal A, and of course school people view that as a school funding system that was adopted, but when it was sold in '93, it was really property tax relief, and so it was viewed as a tax cut for people. And even in that situation, part of it's, why others had failed going up to that. I mean, the legislature, it was an either or. It wasn't like we were doing a Proposal 1 where we're putting something before the voters and saying, vote yes or no on this, and if you vote no, nothing happens. Right. Proposal 1 was, you're voting on sales tax, and if you don't like sales tax, you're getting an income tax change. I mean, and we had that conversation going up to Proposal 1 to say that if you put before the voters an option for something that the legislature views as a needed thing for Michigan, and I would argue on education we have the same dynamic here, that the legislature shouldn't punt. You can ask the voters on what mechanism we're going to do this, but the legislature, if we can get them through parents and our groups and everybody, or their own, hopefully I'll say intelligence, although many that are listening would question that, I think, with the legislature, that they would go to the voters and say, yep, we need to do this. Let's argue about what the dollar amount is and then settle on that dollar amount, and then say, here's how we have to fund it. Pick one of two ways. We're going to run one up the voter flagpole, and the other is going to be in the legislature. And if you vote no on one, then the other is the alternative, because I do think very few people, I mean, unless you can make that strong argument or you're doing it locally and they see it affecting them directly, it's difficult to go to voters. And we see other states doing it, so it's not without ability or without court order. I mean, you could have the court order the legislature to say you have to do something, and then, I mean, the legislature has all kinds of room to increase taxes or revenues for a specific funding piece too. I mean, you don't have to go to the voters to do this if in fact the legislature says it's the right thing to do.
Will this topic be discussed in this fall's regional priority setting meetings?
Yeah, that's a good question. Clearly, we have a couple of places that we're going to talk about this. We actually have, in a week or so, the Michigan Small and Rural Schools Association, along with the School Equity Caucus, is holding a conference here in Lansing, and we have both panel discussions and individual presentations related to the adequacy study. We will have a clinic session at MASB's fall conference. I know at MASA's conference they're going to have a session on it. The priority setting meetings, very clearly this will be talked about. So, you know, I think for every MSBO, at I think a financial strategies meeting in September, they're going to talk about it. So this is the very beginning as it relates to education, and we'll just continue to talk about this. And yes, I think with the priority setting meetings, we'll start talking about kind of that legislative strategy to, you know, elevate the discussion on this too. But, you know, at least from MASB's perspective, and that's all I can answer for, we want to keep this in front of our members. And so it's kind of that adage when you talk about marketing, you need to tell somebody 6 times before they start taking action on it. This will be something that we continue to communicate on throughout this fall, and I would expect into next year, and that includes with our members and with legislators and the governor. And I think, Craig, you mentioned if we did a ballot issue in this state that the business community would have to be a part of it. And I mean, clearly that has to be a discussion we are not compared to, but when states are looked at for here's how to do things, Massachusetts is often one that comes up. And Massachusetts kind of academic side and some of their funding, I mean, it was a business and education coalition that came together and said, here's where we want to be from an academic achievement standpoint, and here's what we're going to need to do structurally, both funding and infrastructure-wise, not building, but how we deliver education. Here's how we get there. And I don't think that, you know, I look back at Proposal A, and I was just starting at that time. What we saw there was a big table of people that included education and business saying, here's what we need to do and put something before the voters. But of course, they were responding to a much different situation. They were responding to the elimination of property tax and the negative impact of that. So it's a much different dynamic, but I think it's difficult to go to any major tax increase, and I think if we're talking about $1 billion, that's significant, if you don't have at least some of the business community on board with you.
Will you be issuing an FAQ?
Actually, that was one of the things that we talked about prior to this, even taking some of the questions that come out of this and using that as part of the FAQ. We've, of course, had other questions that have come up since the study was released. So our intent is, yes, to try to get something out. And what we'll do is probably have it as a, not a static document, but one that we can continue through our website to add questions as they come in. So yeah, actually, we will look at trying to put out an FAQ. I don't have a good timeline on that right now, but I would hope by the time that school starts, we'll have something on our website that's got the questions that we had today, kind of, and then other questions that are being posed by school board members, superintendents, school attorneys that are coming in on a regular basis to us. And we'll also, like we always do, if we don't know an answer, we'll say it's not clear at this point. And a lot of that related to the legislature and what their thoughts are. Other than a couple of interview questions where a reporter has asked a legislator, we have very little knowledge from them just because they haven't been around to even talk about this. And the governor hasn't really said much on it either. Other questions? I know we're coming right up on our hour, but I'm not going to cut it off if we have questions going, but trying to think of other questions. General thoughts from you on this, Craig, just in kind of in general things that I didn't ask you that you had, that you've been thinking about on this study?
Yeah. Well, again, I think it's a conversation starter. On balance, these adequacy studies are important because, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, the big issue in school finance was disparities in funding. And you go from District A to District B and you see huge disparities in funding. And Michigan's reforms of Proposal A have attempted and are continuing to, address that issue. The next step in the discussion of school finance is, well, and this is born out of largely the accountability movement of academic accountability. We've hit these state standards. We have districts being held accountable to these state standards. The logical question is, what does it cost to get districts to this? So these studies are a natural outcome of kind of where both education accountability is going, where school finance is going, and it's a worthwhile conversation to have. Is this the last and final statement on this? No, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be. And the other thing that I would point out is, the legislature, this is in the legislature's hands, like it or not, because the legislature is responsible for, funding education in the state and providing for education in the state. And so they set this up through, school finance model, this revised school code, making changes there. The state board has a role, the governor has a role, but ultimately it's the legislature, and I hope that they take it seriously what this report has to add to that conversation and not just dismiss it out of hand.
Yeah, that's our hope also. And I mentioned, based on one of the questions earlier about how are we going to continue to talk about this, and I mentioned the Small and Rural Conference, and we actually won't have them in person, but Augenblick will be participating via Skype in that conference for us too. So that will give us an opportunity to ask some questions directly. And I think as they have now completed the study, issued the report, it'll be interesting to see, as they talk to groups now in a more public setting, as we ask them the same question about, hey, the parameters of the study, how much did it hamper you? Mm-hmm. It'll be interesting to get their kind of honest feedback on, how this was different than other states and what they would have done different or hope to be able to do differently in the study. And you've kind of alluded to some of that here, and have that honest piece.
Will there be a hearing in the House or Senate?
That's a great question. And as I said, without the legislature in town, it's very difficult to know that. Clearly other reports have come out where the legislature has done hearings. But most typically hearings are related to pieces of legislation. So it's a budget, it's a bill. And so if they want to avoid a hearing, I'll say, it will be easy for them to do because it's not a common practice for them to have some group put out a study, even though this is one requested in law, which is different than most. So it's a good question. No answer on that right now, and partly has just been with the lack of the legislature being around. And I think even from an MASB's perspective, and I even have to think about that politically and say, at what stage, do we want a hearing, and at what stage would you want it? And clearly both sides, those that are in favor of the study and extra expenditures, and those that are saying there's enough money for schools already, we don't need to do anything. You all send your people to these hearings to testify, and sometimes I find that the way that we've turned testimony into some kind of showcase, and at times the flip side would be, yes, we have a hearing on it, or the legislature does, and they, as we've seen, like on the special ed voucher resolution that was out there earlier this year, is you allow testimony from those that are on the side of the sponsor, and then you run out of time, and the people that want to have other opinions don't get to even testify. So in that case, a hearing would be detrimental to actually having a good discussion on this. So good question, but really no answer just because of that.
What is a local school board member to do with this information? What are next practical steps at the board level?
That's a perfect question, and that's one that we're talking about internally. I think we need to, this will be a recorded webinar, so one thing I would say is this would be good to put up on a district's website when we send out the link for just information for parents to understand. I think with MASB and MASA and other groups, we really need to and we had some conversation actually at a retreat of those organizations over the last couple of days to talk about and including the teachers' unions, what kind of common talking points can we come up with that we can share with our boards, with our members, with parents. And so I think that will be forthcoming as we come into the new school year to start raising awareness of this, because the timing that it came out as the school year finished and people went into vacations, as much as those that are sitting here listening to this and those of us in Lansing are all about the adequacy study, I would probably make the argument if you did a survey of the public right now and asked them, do you know what the Michigan Adequacy Study number is? It would be a pretty small percentage. So it's going to be incumbent upon us to raise the visibility of this, and hopefully we can do that. And I think based on conversations I've had over the last couple of days, we'll do that in a concerted effort with all of the stakeholders kind of saying the same thing. And I think we saw it with the State Board of Ed starting it yesterday, very positive comments about the study, everybody admitting that no study is a perfect study and it doesn't have all the answers. It's a great stepping off point. It clearly points out that in significant areas, both in the foundation, we need to be at a higher level to meet what the state is now asking, as you just said, Craig, as it relates to accountability and standards. And I think, in some ways, maybe even more importantly, when we think about that achievement gap, it's that the at-risk student, the English language learner, and even the factor, even though they didn't get into special ed, they have that higher factor, that we have special populations that clearly, to get the gap to move, not the funding gap, but the achievement gap to move, those pieces are pieces that really have to move along with that. And one of the things that was in the study was that whole idea of you can invest X amount and you only get this much. That's across the broad spectrum. When you start looking at investment into our ELL and at-risk populations, you get a much bigger bang for the buck. And I think the governor over the last 2 budget cycles, whether he realized that or whether it was we can't close the gap and keep funding for at-risk at the same level for a 10-year period of time. So, but that's a good question, and to Tim who asked that, more coming on that, and I think it will be a concerted effort from the broader education community to see how do we get that out to the greater membership, how do we get it out to parents, and we have to go beyond that. We need to even have sit-downs with the business communities, others, and talk about, do we have some commonalities that are easy? As we look at this, is there business and education groups that all say, absolutely, we need to do something for at-risk kids? Well, that makes it a lot easier for legislators to take that step if they see a more collaborative approach to it. And I think it'll be up to us to do that reach out and see where there are possible partners.
One final question, because we're on our hour. Did the study address anything about our broken retirement system?
To my knowledge, in looking at it, because they got into expenditures. They do categorize the expenditures, but for how we funded retirement, unless I missed it, it was silent on that.
It's included in the numbers, the foundation dollars that go to MIPSers. Yep. are in the revenue that the districts are reporting. The spending to support those benefits, both for retired and current working employees, are in the expenditure side of things, but there's no call out about that. And they weren't asked to do that, and so there's really no specific analysis related to retirement.
And really what would have been interesting on that is if we didn't have the retirement cap in place right now, so all of the money that's now right around $1 billion that doesn't go to the foundation, goes directly to retirement, which we support in having it done that way. But had we taken that $1 billion, put it into the foundation over the last 4 or 5 years, our foundation would be much higher. Our districts wouldn't have any more money to spend. It would all be going to retirement. But the number that Augenblick would have started with for a foundation, would be much higher. And so the number you would expect would be 86, 67 on top of, whatever. Because in essence, they're looking at the foundation. They're not looking at the total amount spent out of the school aid budget.
Right. They said any money that goes through a school district's finances, anything that comes to the school district, so those retirement dollars that the state is paying for off the top, the $1 billion, comes to your districts, and then they turn around and write the check back to your district. So it comes in as a revenue and it goes out as an expenditure, and so that's accounted for. I think, and we might have to get clarity on this. But I think if those dollars came to districts via the foundation grant, then what we would be doing is comparing that 8667 number not to the current foundation, but the foundation plus those retirement dollars, which would make that gap presumably lower. And again, there's challenges with doing the 8667 number to the foundation because they're just not. It's not an apples to apples comparison.
That might win for the best question because it'll allow. I mean, it's one that really gets into a question for Augenblick in the future, which is, how did you take that money that is being spent in retirement and include that in your 8667 number? So thank you very much. We're at an hour. Good questions. Really, Craig, thank you very much for being here today. As I said, new format, different than kind of the legislative update things that we've done through webinar. I'll be interested in feedback from those that watch today. As we said, small and rural schools and school equity is coming up on August 19th. For those that are members of either of that, that's a conference here in town that you can attend and see more of this in person and hear from more people, including Augenblick. We also have the opportunity for the clinic session at Fall Conference. And there we're going to have Jeff Guilfoyle from Public Sector Consultants talking about it. At the small and rural schools, I think we have David Arson from Michigan State that has already, I'm getting somebody shaking their head saying, nope, that's not who we're going to have. But we have other panelists there that will be talking about their look at this study and their kind of taking it apart. So thank you, everybody, for participating today, and have a great rest of your week.